Hello, my name is Magdalene Dykstra. I'm an artist based in St. Catharines, Ontario. My practice consists of two strands. One is my work with clay, which takes the form of sculptures and large-scale installations. And the second strand is my mark-making practice. My sculptural work with clay, which, as I mentioned, takes the form of sculptures and large-scale installations, usually takes inspiration from microbiology. My sculptures and installations use an aesthetic of cellular accumulation to ask the question of what is the role of an individual within the horde. Using press molds, my sculptures and installations contrast the scale of an individual cell with the larger mass, while at the same time reflecting on our interconnectedness as a species and our interdependence on the earth. One of my largest installations to date was a part of Raw, an exhibition at the Gardner Museum that featured the work of 4 artists, including myself, who work with unfired clay. The reason I like to work primarily with unfired clay is to meditate on the idea of impermanence, particularly as it relates to my own mortality and our transience as a species. Each of my sculptures and installations exist for a brief period of time and then are recycled and the materials reused in the next sculpture or installation. My mark-making practice similarly is reflecting on the mark of an individual in the context of a larger composition. What I do is I apply oxides that are mixed with acrylic medium and then transcribe my fingerprint onto paper or onto walls. Right now I have a large-scale site-specific painting at the Canadian Clay and Glass called Rupture. In this piece, not only did I, but 7 studio assistants worked with me to create a large site-specific painting at the Canadian Clay and Glass, where each of us transcribed our fingerprints directly onto the wall. Similar to my sculptural and installation work, this site-specific painting will only last for the duration of the exhibit and doesn't result in a saleable object, but instead its value comes from existing for that brief period of time before it's ultimately painted over and lost. So today I'm going to show you how I transcribe my presence in my finger paintings. So what I do is I usually use the oxides or even local clay that I've dug up from my garden here in St. Catharines and mix those dry ingredients with acrylic medium. The acrylic medium I'm using is a matte medium, which you can pick up from any art supply store. And today I'm going to be using black iron oxide, which we often find in glaze recipes, sometimes even in clay body recipes. I move back from using pre-processed paints in order to reflect on our interconnectedness with the earth. So in pulling it back and not using pre-prepared paints, but instead remixing my own pigments, I'm looking for more of a material connection to the materials we're pulling from the earth, mining from the earth. So I've squeezed out a little bit of acrylic medium. I don't want to pour that on the floor. And what I'm going to do next is just spoon a little bit of black iron oxide into that acrylic medium. And using a brush, I'll mix the dry ingredient. Hopefully you can see that. I'm mixing the dry oxide with the acrylic medium. The nice surprise that I regularly get from using oxides and clay and locally dug clay and mixing that with acrylic medium is I'm not perfectly preparing this pigment, contrary to industrially produced paints. There are chunks that remain in my own hand mixed pigment, which sometimes obscure my fingerprint from being revealed on the paper or on the wall, which is something else I like to think about in my work. The visibility of the mark of an individual versus the anonymity or even obscurity of that individual. So in this piece here, you can see that in this sort of white hazy image on beige paper, what I've done here is I've used silica, which we usually see in glaze ingredient or in glaze recipes, mixed with some gouache paint to help to solidify the whiteness. But also you can see that in different parts of this mark making, my fingerprint fades. So that is, again, a way of reflecting on my presence fading and my mortality. So what I'll do today is go over to this new piece of paper. Oftentimes I use a vertical direction. I'm really interested in the feeling of these fingerprints cascading down the page or down the wall as though like a waterfall. This time though, just to change things up, I'm actually going to be working upwards. So oftentimes when I'm starting a new piece, I'll decide on the overall feeling I want the work to have or the overall sense of direction. And then from there, it's quite an intuitive process where I will have chosen the sense of direction or the overall feeling. And then the only other rule is to print with my finger until the pigment wears off. And then I reload my finger with pigment and begin again. So I have pigment on my brush. I apply it to my finger. And I'm going to start at the bottom for this one and print until my finger is empty of pigment. I reload my brush, apply more pigment to my finger. Another rule I generally keep in mind for myself is I don't like there to be firm horizontal lines. I want the work to look a little more natural than that. So while I am moving in a straight vertical line with my printing, you'll see I'm not going immediately next to the prior strip of marks that I've made. My fingerprints start to sort of climb up the page. In the site-specific painting at the Canadian Clay and Glass, you'll see that the fingerprints don't line up horizontally, and instead, because they are cascading down the wall, they're always moving a little bit lower and there are no straight horizontals. And that helps me to imbue the work with a sense of movement, whether cascading down or rising up. The repetition involved in creating these works, but also my works in clay, allow for my studio practice to take on a sort of meditative quality in making the same move over and over again, whether it be in my hand mixed pigment or whether it be in clay. There's an opportunity to sort of quiet the mind from all the noise that usually fills my brain on a regular day, and allows me to think about some of those deeper ideas that I like to embed in all of my work. So the idea of visibility versus anonymity. So for example, with these finger paintings, this is undeniably the most individual mark, or one of the most individual marks my body can make. But at the same time, as soon as I step away from these finger paintings, that transcription of my being becomes anonymous. You wouldn't know it was mine unless I told you. So that's one of the things I like to think about as I'm making these works. But also, as I mentioned earlier, the fact that I print my mark until it fades, until there's no more pigment left, allows me to meditate on the fact that my presence is fading actively. And ultimately, my presence will be no more than a lingering whisper. Part of what was really exciting for me to create the site-specific painting at the Canadian Clay and Glass Gallery was to work with other studio assistants to open up the opportunity of making oneself visible to other women and people of color and members of the LGBTQ community, all communities of people who have been either forgotten or actively subjugated within the context of our Canadian society. So sharing the opportunity to make ourselves visible was a really important opportunity for me to be able to share with those studio assistants. Thanks for joining me in the studio today.